Thank you. So, welcome everybody to tonight's discussion on recent events in Chile with our guest Francisco Dominguez. He's a former Chilean refugee who came to this country in 1979 to escape the Pinochet regime. He's an academic in Latin American studies at Middlesex University, secretary of the Venezuelan Solidarity Campaign, and a member of the executive committee of Cuba Solidarity and Nicaragua Action, along with many other organizations. So without further ado, over to you, Francisco.
Well, evening, everyone. Thank you very much for the invitation in the first place, but also for the large attendance of our clinic, which is great. It's excellent that there is this much interest in development in Chile. Up to, I would say, a couple of years ago, Chile was not in the vanguard, but was in the rear guard, was very conservative. Very, very conservative. The various governments that came to office from 1990 after the dictatorship was defeated at the referendum were basically managing neoliberalism. And I want to posit that the center-left that ran the country for 24 years of the 32, I think it is, ever since 1990. They perfected neoliberalism. And as a consequence of that, my perception, I'm an economist as well, my perception is that Chile is the most neoliberal country in the world. I'll justify that later on. And what they managed to do after the more or less insurrectionary opposition to Pinochet started in 1983 all the way to 1986, 87, the center-left, the perfecters of neoliberalism, they managed to demobilize the mass movement massively, to the point that, you know, there was almost no movement. Since, I would say, 1990, there have been 2 or 3 instances of explosions of mass mobilization against aspects of neoliberalism. There was one in 2006, just to mention a few, there's not many. 2006, secondary school students, you know, went into the streets to complain about the privatization of secondary education and the quality of it and so on. They were brutally repressed. In 2011, the university students were the ones who mobilized against the further privatization of education, of higher education, and able to mobilize behind them secondary school students. Then they moved towards mobilizing the parents. Then they were able to mobilize the trade unions. Then they were able to mobilize society as a whole. In 2011 was quite a benchmark, quite a moment in terms of the struggle against neoliberalism, which was a difficult battle in the Chilean context. It was in the 2011 university, student struggle that actually prominent figures came out. The star politically at the time was a communist member, a communist activist, Camila Vallejo, who became an extraordinary political figure in the nation, still is. And at that time, there was a bunch of young university students activists who actually became the leadership of that. Another one of them, apart from Camila, was Carol Cariola, who's also a member of the Communist Party, still active today, still in the same party. And a third one, I won't mention all of them, only those three. It was a guy called Gabriel Boric. At the time, they shook neoliberalism to some degree. The government made some concessions, but they were also brutally repressed. And imagine, we have to wait 10 more years for a real serious mass challenge to neoliberalism to take place, which took place in 2019. It was on the 18th of October 2019. They call it estallido social, which translates as social explosion. Secondary school kids faced with an increase in the transport fare for Santiago, particularly the capital city, in the metro, the underground, but also the buses. They decided to rebel against this and not pay. And what they did, they jumped the machines, the machines that prevent you from coming in unless you have some card. They just deliberately jump over. And they were confronted by the police. These produced quite a significant reaction among the student body. And it elicited a huge amount of solidarity socially, but not necessarily mobilization yet. They were brutally repressed, typical fashion of Chilean neoliberalism, or neoliberalism in general anyway. And in the next 2 days, after the 18th of October social explosion, mysteriously 78 metro stations were burned by vandals. Everybody knows now that this was deliberately provoked by sections of the state in order to justify the demonization of the movement and repress them so brutally. They went for the kill. Extraordinarily, these provocations by the state, which involved public buildings, involved supermarkets, involved the vandalization of everything, including looting of supermarkets and shops. It was clearly done by them. I mean, obviously, some people took advantage of trying to redistribute income, let me put it that way. But most of the damage, clearly, in my view, was done by the state forces. There is, I don't know how many, there are literally thousands of videos of the actual events, what happened exactly at those days. And there is several, but there is one I want to highlight, where there is a couple of police cars around the supermarket, and the cops with uniform are going in and taking plasma TVs, large quantities of them, put them into their own cars and running away, running off with them. So they were doing the looting. I think the whole idea of the state at that time, current government, this is very right-wing, was to demonize them and isolate them from society to such a degree of demonization that would allow the state to really crush them. I mean, when I say crush them, I meant literally crush them. After the vandalization of property in the next few days, suddenly these exploded into a mass national mobilization, which the state never expected. It was so large, so unprecedented, so extraordinary, so spontaneous, that actually people, tongue-in-cheek today, refer to this refer to the 18th of October 2019 explosion. They refer to it as the October Revolution, deliberately, just to make the connection, as it were, which is very nice. What was more interesting from my point of view, I was delighted that this was going on. was that the mass movement were using the music that was popular during the Allende period. They were using, the songs by Victor Jara. One of the most wonderful ones, which became pretty much emblematic during an important part of the explosion of the rebellion, was a song by Victor Jara, The Right to Live in Peace, which he composed in homage to the resistance of the Vietnamese people against US aggression. And that became, as it were, the hymn. And then they adopted, eventually, the song of the hymn, the main song of the popular unity period, El Pueblo Unido Jamás Será Vencido. I don't need to translate because everybody in the world knows this. And they were marching in the street, with placards of Salvador Allende, Victor Jara, and singing this thing. So it was extraordinary. Imagine our emotion over here when we saw that finally, what we tried to do was restarting by fresh, young, pure, combative people. This was extraordinary. The government responded with brutality, and they used the method of civilized France, under Macron, which is to shoot rubber bullets to people's faces to make them blind. And the number of people, according to the human rights organizations that exist in the country, the Institute of Human Rights, calculates that something in the region of 450, mainly young people, suffer, injury from these bullets. They were deliberately pointed at the head. This was obviously an instruction that the officers on the ground were giving to the cops, to the repressive forces, and these officers would not give these orders without getting instructions from the Minister of Interior. And the Minister of Interior would not give these orders without getting the nod from the president himself. So this was clearly went all the way to the top. And imagine, they believe 450, they raped people when they detained them. They raped young men, young women, everybody. They brutalized them, they tortured them, they detained them illegally. They went on the rampage for about a year and a half. They haven't stopped. They're still doing a little bit of it, but nothing as much as they were doing during the height of the tensions. And, we saw footage of cops coming out of their prisons before getting into the car to go and repress people with their full gear, sniffing a white powder, which I don't think they were using it for cosmetic purposes. Obviously, to get into the spirit of, to go for it. The mass demonstrations did not abate. No matter what they did, it grew bigger and bigger and bigger, and the challenge became larger and larger and larger. By the time when the president was desperate because he knew he was losing the politics of it, and society was turning against them, even establishment politicians, he said that the country was at war with a very dangerous enemy, which was powerful and implacable. And at the time, the media went potty, blaming Venezuelans and Cubans for being behind the whole thing. You can imagine. Then they began to harass, particularly Venezuelans who are immigrants in a xenophobic manner. That is to say, they began to lose their grip, and they began to turn towards dirty tricks of the worst possible kind. But they were defeated. And even though the repression continued, the government was forced to make concessions. I don't want to tell you the whole story blow by blow because it would take too long, but just to concentrate on the key concessions that the masses managed to get. One of the consequences of the explosion and the combination of that with the pandemic was that people, and there is a huge level of people working in the informal sector in Chile, despite the propaganda. People who do not work daily do not eat. That is to say, in order for them to be able to eat, they have to go out to work. They're mainly street sellers, that kind of thing. So when the government used repression and used the lockdown, used the pandemic, in order to try to stop the mobilization, hundreds of thousands, we do not know exactly how many yet, hundreds of thousands of people went hungry, families, and that broke the back of the government. When people decided to challenge the curfew and the repression is when eventually the whole thing burst. And the first concession the government made was that as a request and demand of the population was that they were returned 10% of the contributions that they as workers had made to the pension system. The pension system in Chile is 100% privatized. It's run by what is known as administrators of pension funds, which are, hedge funds. Is the model, is come from Pinochet. Pinochet instituted these at the time of the dictatorship. And it's essentially large scale, robbery. That's what it is. It's no other. People contributed for 30, 20 years that paid miserable pensions. And when you demand that they pay you more, these pension funds, which are private companies, multinational companies, they're all involved in this. They take you to court. You're not going to win. So the threat of, they taking you to court if you complain about them settling your pension unjustly, then you're going to lose. And as a result of that, people have been cowed to accepting these robberies. So one of the main, very strongly felt demands was the return of these monies. 10% was returned. This was passed in Congress. I couldn't believe it. These deals a serious blow to financial capital in Chile. Then they demand another 10%, which they won as well. Then they demand another 10%, which they won as well. And then eventually there was a demand for a forced withdrawal, what they call withdrawal, and that did not get enough votes. The reason was technical. Many MPs were outside, were busy, some of them were ill. The meeting was called as an emergency and so forth. So that is a serious, serious defeat of financial capital, Chilean neoliberal style. That was fantastic. Then they did more. The mass movement realized that the problem did not lie in the austerity package being implemented by President Piñera, our right-wing president, but because of the economic model. So they decided to change the economic model. And they basically said it's not 30 pesos, which was the increase in the fare, but it is 30 years of it. And we want a new model. So they demanded to have some sort of constituent assembly elected so that they could actually prepare the ground to produce a draft of a new constitution. This was another extraordinary thing. The government was on the floor, have to accept this. This was passed. And when it came to the referendum, there was a discussion as to who was going to draft it and what would be the conditions. I'm trying to cut a long story short here. The referendum supported the new constitution idea by 77%. And they also approved by an assembly elected by the people being in charge of drafting the new document by 78%. That was unbelievable. So this was becoming nearly revolutionary. I don't want to exaggerate. Chile is not as revolutionary as I would like it to be, unfortunately. So they managed to get this concession. This assembly has been elected. And there are two important things that I want to highlight. Number one, it is a chamber or an assembly of 155 representatives from the people. 76% of them actually represents those who want a new constitution, and only 23% actually are against it, because it was an open democratic election. So we have an instrument now that is in charge democratically to actually change the neoliberal constitution. This is being drafted as we speak. But more important than that, emblematically, they decided to elect Elisa Loncon Antileo as the president of the assembly. Elisa Loncon Antileo is a leader of the Mapuche indigenous community, which has been brutalized in the South by 500 years of colonialism, republicanism, neoliberalism, capitalism, and all the isms imaginable except socialism. So this is incredible. And then this was the process that was running through, and it was going through like a knife through butter of neoliberalism. Neoliberalism was not able to resist. But at the same time, there were scheduled presidential elections, which is what complicated the story. And in the elections, there was a huge, and this is one of the problems that the left faces, there is a huge amount of fragmentation, on the left. People can ask me questions so that I don't have to give too much description at this stage. It's very strong, is mobilized, is organized around single issues, water, the pension systems, the right of the indigenous people. And so women have played a magnificent role in all this stuff, magnificent, like never before. So they are organized in single issue things, but they're not coming together. I think the assembly is bringing them back. And therefore, the constitution inevitably, in my view, is going to actually enshrine all of these principles, all of these campaigns. It's already been more or less public. So these presidential elections at the beginning produced confusion because the right wing, the extreme right wing, led by a presidential candidate called Jose Antonio Cast, an extreme Pinochetista. I'm not sure whether that's possible, but it is in Chile. Really extreme right wing. I think next to him, Pinochet might look like a liberal, if you see what I mean. He proposed to close immediately the Ministry for Women. He proposed Chile to withdraw from the United Nations. He proposed to set up special places which were not necessarily prisons to arrest and detain and interrogate, he said, people who were vandalized in society and being a threat because of their activism and their radicalism. He was against same-sex marriage. I mean, really horrific, absolutely horrific. And he won the first round of the election with 27%. And the other candidate who was projected as a very interesting guy was Gabriel Boric, that managed to get 25% of the vote. Gabriel Boric, the same one of the student insurrection of 2011. And there were enormous fears everywhere that this could, produce a catastrophe if the right wing were able to win. And the reason why there were these fears is because in Chile, the issue of the dictatorship has never been good. There is impunity. I don't want to use expletives, but feel like these nasty murderers are still around. They haven't been punished. Very few of them have. the constitution that we have in the country is the constitution promulgated by Pinochet and the dictatorship conditions in 1980. It's exactly the same. The system is such that it's unbelievable, and so on and so on. So you can imagine the fear that there was that Kast might have won, because if Kast had become the president in the second round by winning it, he would have stopped the Constituent Assembly right away, because Chile is a presidential system, and it would have been a really obstacle for the process, and would have to go to something very nasty, very dramatic. You can imagine what would happen. As it turned out, in the second round, Gabriel Boric won with 56%. It was extraordinary. Even though the Ministry of Interior, that's right, the minister in charge of ensuring that there was sufficient transport for the people to go out to vote, took all the buses out on exactly election day. There were no buses, none. And you don't have sufficient, polling stations in the country. So people waited for 2 and 3 and 4 hours to be able to make it, but they didn't give up. They waited. And they organized, lift and so on, and they managed to win. So had it not been for the withdrawal of the buses, that 56% would have been certainly greater, in my view. And then you have Gabriel Boric, who is a very young man. He's 35. I'm not too worried about that. Fidel, I'm not saying he's the same as Fidel, he's not. But when Fidel took power in Cuba in 1959, he was 32, and Che Guevara was 29. So this is a new generation. 35 years old is, he's got a lot of experience. And so this has given a huge impetus to the constituency process, which is what matters to me particularly, even though it was very important to win the election. And there's been a lot of confusion, particularly, I don't want to use this sort of terminology, but all sections of the ultra-left have sort of been saying all sorts of things against him. His very first political act of Gabriel Boric's was to actually visit the Constituent Assembly and go to express his total support for the process to the president, Elisa Roncon Antileo, the indigenous woman. They appeared on national television. He went to have her, and the vice president, and he said, we're going to go that way, which is excellent. This is a real clear message. We are full of, expectations. This is wonderful. And what is interesting, just finally, is that Fabiola Campillay, just one example. Fabiola Campillay was one of the activists, a young woman, who went into the streets to demonstrate, for democracy, justice, and everything else. And she was hit by rubber bullets in both eyes. She's totally blind. And she decided to stand as a candidate for the Senate in the presidential election that took place at the same time. And she became the most voted candidate of the whole country. Give you an idea of where we are. So, 2 problems. Number one, and I'll finish with this too. Number one, the left in Chile is very fragmented. Very, very fragmented. One of the key components of the vanguard that we need to create. I'm going to help morally from here because I wish I was there helping out. But one of the key components of the vanguard that we need to create is definitely the Communist Party. I've been working with them, the Chilean Communist Party. I've been working with them. Their line is fantastic. It's totally clear. And although in the previous period there was some confusion regarding all sorts of things, but when it came to these, they were absolutely down the line. They have the best analysis, as far as I can tell, and they are part of the coalition of Gabriel Boric, the coalition that won the election. They're part of the same coalition. But the Communist Party itself is small, it's not sufficiently large, and it doesn't have that links and those roots with the mass movement, which is new in the country, throughout the nation, in order to it become that leadership. So it needs to coalesce with others. And that is a task to be done. And the second problem that we need to take into account in our analysis, our expectations and what is coming, is that neoliberalism in Chile is very strong. It's extremely strong. And I don't mean that in a sort of state power sense. I mean that in an economic sense. Let me finish with this. The only, and I stress that, the only successful neoliberal experiment in the world, the only one is Chile. It failed now, it's gone. But for as long as it lasted, it was the only successful one. So from that point of view, the reason why, from that point of view, Chilean neoliberalism is strong is because it managed to win over the masses ideologically to the idea of the market. In this struggle, we are winning the masses back, and we have managed to have done what we have done. So that's one of the things. And number two, part of the same second problem, is that the amount of reform that we need to undertake in order to dismantle neoliberalism is ginormous. It's not going to be easy. So it's going to be bumpy, it's going to be messy, but I know we'll get there. So viva Chile. Thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
That was wonderful. Thank you, Francisco. I'd like to open up the floor to any questions now. If anyone's got a question for Francisco, do you want to put your hand up and I can bring you in?
Listen, there was one in the chat from Stuart McGill.
All right, yes. So Stuart, do you want to unmute yourself and ask yourself?
Yeah.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I normally get that wrong. That's the first time this year I got that one right. Okay. Thank you very much for that, Francisco. Very interesting. I just put something up in the chat from the clinic. Gabriel Salazar Boric can't really do anything, this guy says in the article, because the big problems are all down to the Constitutional Convention. Basically, his hands are tied until that's sorted out. To what extent do you agree with that one, mate?
I don't agree with that. I don't want to characterize the clinic that much, but I think they tend to take a cynic view of politics, which is, before Boric, she was reasonable, but not anymore. There is a kind of dual power sui generis situation in Chile. On the one hand, you have the masses expressing themselves in a big way in the convention or Constituent Assembly, let's call it like that, as a shorthand. And on the other hand, you have this original traditional establishment, Congress and so on, and the presidency. Chile has a presidential system. In other words, the president has a very strong institutional position in the state. The president can undertake and initiate legislation. All presidents have done in Chile, from the very beginning. So there is plenty of things that the president himself can do. If you take the presidency and you take this in alliance with the Constituent Assembly, then obviously a great deal can be done. The difficulty is we are just at the beginning. The Constituent Assembly or the Constitutional Convention is going to produce this document, this draft, this coming September in 2022. And Boric is going to be inaugurated in March 2022. So between now and March, Boric is discussing some reforms he wants to introduce. And the first he's already saying that he's going to introduce is the reform of the tax system, where the rich is less proportionally than the poor. Chile is that kind of country. The poor in Chile pays more taxes proportionally than the rich. So this is going to be changed. And the key reason is he wants to ensure that there is social justice, and he needs the resources, and the resources are in the country, since so much has been able to be extracted from the bourgeoisie, to use traditional terminology, then more can be done, especially if they are in a pincer movement. Let me use that image. In a pincer movement between the Constituent Assembly, the presidency, and the mass movement, which is enormous. So I think in that sense, plenty can be done if the parliament, where the right wing is strong. And the reason why the right wing is strong in this election, in this parliament, is because it doesn't have a majority, but it's strong, sufficiently to complicate things. The reason why they're strong is because the mass movement that actually fielded candidates for the Constituent Assembly did not field candidates for the Congress, except very few of them. So that's why the representation that we have in parliament is skewed. Nevertheless, if the parliament were to be too obstructive, the president in Chile had the possibility of resorting to a referendum. And I know when it comes to a referendum, we will win, hands down. So plenty can be done. I think at this particular point in time, this is my sense, this is not what Boric has said. At this particular point in time, whenever you have a transition from a right-wing government to a left-wing government, even if it's not a revolutionary government, the right wing organizes all sorts of tricks and terrible things to the economy. They take capital away, take a round on the currency, they disinvest, they do all sorts of things. So my sense is that Boric is trying to prevent any nasty thing being done between now and March, when he's going to be inaugurated. So everything is up for grabs, as it were. I don't want to use that badly, but you know what I mean. There's plenty of possibility for the mass movement. And Boric has already said he wants the new constitution. He says no more private pension systems, no more. He said in the speech when, talked to the masses on election day when he won. And there is plenty of other things that he wants to do. But we have to wait and see exactly how this is going to shape up.
Thanks, Francisco. We've got a couple of people with their hands up. We've got Bob first. Do you want to unmute yourself, Bob, and ask your question?
Thank you, Alison. Thank you, Francesco. I've been listening to you for the best part of 30 years, I think now, and you always never fail to inspire and educate me. The thing, I want to believe everything that you say in one sense, but I thought Miguel Diaz-Canel's cordial congratulations said something when he gave it after he'd been elected. And I don't know whether that was linked to the fact that on July the 11th, Boric sort of criticized Cuba and Miguel himself and supported, in my mind, the protesters who weren't real protesters, but paid agents of the United States. And I don't know if that was just to derail his opposition at that time, because he was up against, in that runoff, against a communist mayor. But it seemed to be a bit unnerved by those comments and worried about it. I wonder whether you think there was anything other than just electioneering and he's going to be true to, or whether that was actually a moment that wasn't quite right.
Thanks, Bob, for those kind of words. It's very difficult to know, to be definite about exactly his politics regarding what he sees as democracy in these three countries. Three countries, because he also mentioned Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela. And we do not know. But we do know, I mean, I do not know exactly how this is going to pan out of him as president regarding these things, regarding these countries. He did say that as far as he was concerned, there was no democracy in any of these countries. At some point, I think he even used the word dictatorship, to be totally clear on this. Nevertheless, he has defended these countries before, not once, several times. I do not know exactly what this means in terms of the current situation. My sense is this, and this is just a purely provisional sense. When you are a presidential candidate like him, and the media assail you literally 24/7 on Venezuela, Cuba, and Nicaragua, every single hour of the day, hundreds of them, in all sorts of ways. What the purpose of this is to make Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua the issue of the campaign, the issue of the election. So you have to find a way of killing it, right? When he said these things, those three countries disappear from the political discussion. So that's my sense of it, because he has been congratulated by Maduro with no conditionalities or whatever. He is being congratulated by Ortega without any, caveats of any kind whatsoever, but also by Miguel Díaz-Canel, then Lula, López Obrador, and everybody else. Just one indication is interesting in this regard. Sebastián Piñera, who is a nasty piece of work, is a corrupt politician of the worst possible kind. Although, all our bourgeoisies in Latin America compete to be in the worst and most corrupt, of course, which is a hard call. But I think, he's been in the Panama Papers, he's been in the Pandora Papers, he's been on everything. Sebastián Piñera, as a sort of crass trick, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, invited Boric to accompany him in his last tour as president of Latin America. Piñera is going to tour Latin America. And the first country he is visiting is Colombia. And, he invited Boric, and Boric said, look, this is your own project. I'm not going. We have our own things. So if it was as right-wing or as horrible as one imagined in order to appease the right-wing, that would have been a good opportunity to do so. I think that was the reason why Piñera made the invitation. It was totally clear, it fell flat on his face. So that's a clear indication. So you have not only that he committed himself to the convention, but also now a clear message on the question of Colombia, which is not totally clear in terms of, condemning Duque, but certainly saying, I had nothing to do with the right wing and your project, which is a second indication. Because he's not yet the president, he cannot come out with everything yet, because he's putting together a coalition that is not there yet in terms of a coalition government. So we have to keep an eye on it. And, as soon as they do anything wrong, there is a strong mass movement that is going to come out very strongly to tell him what to do or what not to do, if you see what I mean.
Cheers, comrade.
Sure.
Thank you. And next we got Kev.
Yes, two linked questions, Francisco. One is on reaction and how you think the Chilean ruling class, military, and the US State Department will react to the victory of the left coalition. And secondly, what's the likely impact of the new president on Chile's foreign policy, in particular regional alliances?
The US has been extremely cautious. I mean, they didn't appear to have intervened. Oh, good evening, Kevin, by the way. So I should have said that. The US has been extremely cautious. There's no evidence that they intervened in the election. There was no intervention whatsoever. As far as we can tell, nobody we know. The ambassador says something. There is a statement from the State Department. There is something that happens. On this occasion, there was zero. We're very surprised. Normally they do. So when Boris won the Biden and Anthony Blinken, I think it was, congratulated him. Anthony Blinken congratulated the president of Honduras as well. So he's got no choice, I suppose. So we do not know what the United States are likely to do. I think the worry of the United States is this, and maybe I'm moving into regional regional dimension here a bit more. The 3-4 countries in the region that have most of the lithium in the world, which is the next, industrial economic expansion that is coming, are Bolivia, Peru, Chile, and Argentina. If these countries actually set up a cartel, there is already a proposal to set up a sort of like an OPEC kind of lithium type of cartel, type of organization. The ones who are running the show on that one are the Bolivians, who have most of the international connections already. So Chile was the unknown quantity. And obviously Boric realizes, and I think he knows, he hasn't said it yet. But certainly the people in the convention already said they want that. The United States, therefore, will be extremely worried about this. We'll see what they do regarding, foreign policy. I doubt very much, but obviously we have to watch that space. I doubt very much that the Boric president is going to continue with the Lima group. They're not going to support the Lima group. I don't think they're going to leave the Organization of American States. The conditions in Chile do not allow for that. Nevertheless, I don't think they're going to give too much credibility to the Organization of American States in terms of their right-wing policies and so on. And very likely, we're beginning to see, we're seeing the beginnings of it already, very likely through very capable operators politically, such as Mexican President López Obrador, who is already deep into Bolivia. They're going to create a context within which, they're going to sort of make sure that they push him along in the right direction. I don't think Boric, Chile has any chance outside that sort of regional context. There is no possibility. If he were to isolate himself from that, which is possible but unlikely, then I think he will isolate himself politically and he will up for being ousted or destabilized very dramatically. So I doubt very much that he's going to go that way. He fits more politically in the Puebla group, which is a group of left-wing presidents, which include Lula, Evo Morales, López Obrador, Fernández from Argentina, and a few others. These are the figures that are part of it. In that Puebla group, which is a very interesting group that has come out very strongly in support of Cuba, in support of Venezuela, and in support of Nicaragua. López Obrador, 2 weeks ago, maybe a bit more, said that Cuba should be given a sort of Nobel Prize for resistance publicly, as a president. So even though López Obrador is not revolutionary, clearly Boric fits within that category more than in the Sao Paulo Forum, where the more militant ones are. The Cuban Communist Party, the Venezuelan Socialist Party, the Sandinista Front, and so on. Doesn't fit there better, but the two, Sao Paulo Forum and the Puebla Group, are working together. So it is literally, in my view, impossible to come out of that, because the only other alternative would be to join Bolsonaro or Duque in Colombia, which is not possible. So I have tremendous good expectations regarding, foreign policy, especially because the movement is not going to allow anything different. And more important, that if you make these alliances regionally, you're going to get more things than if you don't. If you join Bolsonaro or the United States, you're going to get military bases and, destabilization and brutality. Whereas if you join the others, you get vaccines, you get loads of things. So in that sense, I'm very hopeful and quite optimistic regarding the internal forces. The possibility that they might go for a coup d'etat. The United States is not capable of doing that as well or as easily as it used to do. Not anymore. Clearly not anymore. Whenever they try, they fail. They fail in Bolivia, even though it took a year, but they fail in Bolivia. So the army is being investigated in Chile, and the police force is being investigated for an extraordinarily colossal amount of corruption. They literally robbed billions and billions and billions over 20 years or so. There are several generals who are in prison. And the proposal that is in the desk of the National Convention of the National Assembly or Constituent Assembly, let's call it some way, is for the total restructuring of the police force and for creating a different kind of ethics in the armed forces, especially after people suffer all of this. I think this has tempered any willingness on the part of the generals or the top brass, to sort of go for something adventurous. They have to confront a very strong mass movement. How long any coup is going to last after, they find massive reputation in the region and so on. So I think we are okay there, even though some adventure is possible, is unlikely to go for it because they are too disorganized, too dislocated, and too corrupt. I mean, the road is so intense. So that's why we have to be optimistic on those two counts.
Thanks, Francisco. Next up, we've got Barry. Do you want to unmute yourself, Barry, and ask your question?
Yes, I'm unmuted. Good evening, Alison. Good evening, Comrade. Comrade Dominguez, I'd like to ask you a question, please. Quite perplexed, really. It's evident that Chile is still hostile politically. And after the murderous years of Pinochet and the exile of thousands, tens of thousands of people, I'm surprised to hear you that the left is fragmented, as you say, with the Americans, with its usual influences, with you saying that the army can be kind of cultured into creating a coup, possibly in the future. Aren't the people of Chile setting themselves up for a return of another Pinochet and a right-wing fascist government?
I mean, the left is thanks for the question, comrades. The left is fragmented, but when you are fragmented and you produce something like the, Constituent Assembly that puts together all your issues, my God, the issue of the resolving of the fragmentation of the left can be resolved very quickly. I'm not saying it's going to be resolved immediately, but certainly there is a sort of institutional vehicle that will bring together a program, through a constitution, because the idea is that the constitution enshrines the principle of what people want. For example, I'm not sure people know this. In Chile, rivers are privatized. The sea is privatized. Lakes are privatized. Mountains are privatized. You name it, it's privatized. And these are the central questions that are going to be enshrined in the constitution. And the reason why this is a matter of life or death is not just a question of being ecological, even though that matters as well, or being pro-environment, is because as a result of the privatization of rivers, lakes, and so on, people do not have sufficient drinking water in many places. And as a result of that, they suffer shortages and bad services and so on. They're absolutely disgusted with the level of abuse by the utilities, by the private companies that run the utilities. They do what they want. They increase prices for your telephone. They increase prices for your gas. They increase prices for your water. They do whatever the electricity is. It's a sort of open field for them to do whatever they want. And there is no limitation to what they're able to do because the market rules totally supreme. Not anymore. This is going to definitely be there. There is already discussions. I do not know what the result is going to be. There are already discussions to bring them on the public ownership. That's the proposal. And Boric himself, in one of the discussions, in the presidential campaign, he said, in my region, he's from the far south, in my region, he said, this company, Gasco, which is one of the big monopolies of distribution of gas, they said one company buys from the central provider, which is in combination with the state and others, and buys at one price and sells it 3 times the price. You know, it charges 3 times, 300%, just like that. He said, everybody knows this, yet nobody does anything. He said, I had enough of this, we're going to stop this. So if you think about the pension system, if you think about, you know, the utilities, if you think about national environment being brought under some, not only scrutiny, but institutional and constitutional provision, then obviously this is created the conditions for sorting out the fragmentation of the left. If they do, they do. If they don't, we fail. So this is the challenge, and I think they know it. The question is, which is going to be the vehicle? You know, we do not know what the vehicle is going to be. In various other places in Latin America, the vehicle has been a front. In Honduras, for example, there was a front of national resistance, which actually brought together all the organizations, Afro-descendants, trade unions, environmentalists, indigenous people, and so on, peasants, and put them together in this front. And this front, after 12 years, became a party. Well, after less than 12 years, became a political party called Libre, Libertad y Refundación, Freedom and Refoundation, to refound the nation. And now this party, Libre, after 12 years of the founding of the Frente, is the government of the nation in Honduras. We won. And the president is a woman. So imagine what can be done by just coming together. So Chile has all the conditions for this. I doubt, I mean, you know, until we see what happens after the March when Boric is inaugurated, we do not know whether they'll go for a coup. But when Allende was elected, Allende won the election in September 1970. I remember this vividly. I worked for the campaign so heavily, and I couldn't vote because I wasn't old enough. And then on, 4th of September night, we went outside to celebrate because we won. Between 4th September and 4th of November, 1970, 2 months, the period between the winning of the election and inauguration, there were 3 attempts at coup d'etat, 3. And the commander-in-chief was assassinated in that period. So it is possible that this happened, but so far, there is no indication whatsoever of any kind. There is no sense of desperation and crisis. There is just a sense of, on the right wing, there is a sense of impotence. They do not know what to do. They're trying to reorganize themselves because they have a political crisis themselves. So I remain optimistic. If there was that small possibility of coup d'etat, you can imagine, from Mexico all the way down to Patagonia, they will immediately come down like a ton of bricks on everybody who tries to do something silly. So that's why I'm optimistic.
Thanks, Francisco. Can I bring Phil Katz in now, please?
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Francisco. That was a fantastic introduction. When you were talking about gas prices and water and privatization, I thought you were talking about Britain for a second. What I wanted to say to you was, if you look at current government advice for investors in Britain from the Department for International Trade and also the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office, reads, Chile is a good place to do business, rating in first place in the region for economic freedom, ease of doing business, competitiveness, particularly its strong institutional setup, solid macroeconomic stability, low levels of both public deficit and public debt. We remember the role very well of the financiers in the city over here in destabilizing the Popular Unity government, especially the dominance of the copper industry. My question to you is, does British imperialism still have these kind of interests in Chile?
Yes, absolutely. British imperialism participated directly and actively in the coup against Bolivia. They wanted the lithium. They've been involved in Guyana to try to, organize some sort of military shenanigans against Venezuela. They have an active policy regarding Colombia, supporting the worst possible aspects of that, including the military. They really want the lithium in Bolivia. They definitely want the lithium in Chile, and I'm sure they're having some regarding that right now. The main problem for us is not the British imperialism, which is a sort of appendix of US imperialism when it comes to these things, even though they can be very skillful. The main problem for us is whether the United States is able to organize something. And at the moment, it looks like the Biden administration seems to be not very clear. There is a sort of inertia. They keep doing what they were doing before. They know that this doesn't work, and they haven't come out with anything new regarding what to do. For example, just to give you an example of the confusion and ambiguity that there is coming out from Washington. There is a group of fascists in Bolivia. They're really nasty. During the period of the coup, the 11 months of the Añez government, when they were persecuting socialist, indigenous people, trade unionists, and so on, arresting them, brutalizing them in the streets. This fascist group, Cochala Youth is called, they were on the rampage. The government of Luis Arce won the election, the left came back, and the US ambassador, like 3 months after that, 3-4 months after that, sent a very serious public warning to the president of Bolivia, saying these extreme groups of the right are a threat to democracy, and the government of Bolivia should do something about it. I thought, what? What is going on? So clearly, they don't want to antagonize governments that are coming on the left, that are coming to power to office, because they feel or they fear that this may alienate them even worse. I mean, they haven't lost the region yet, but it's clearly the case that, the days when the left was running the region are coming back slowly but relentlessly. And that's what they're worried about. And the Chilean example is the worst possible, the Chilean outcome with this election, I think is the worst possible outcome that they could expect, because they had a shining example of how wonderful, capitalism and neoliberalism could be. And now the masses came out in the street and showed how rotten it is, how horrible, nasty, unjust, unfair, and brutal it is, in every possible aspect of it, literally every single day. There are information, people are coming out and taking their destiny in their own hands. So this shining example has gone to pieces now, and they haven't got anything else to show, except what? The United States, Britain, Europe. Give me a break, excuse my colloquialism, but you see what I mean? So we'll see what they do. I think the lithium is just too important. And the second important thing regarding the bargaining position of Chile in the world economy is copper. Chile is the largest producer of copper in the world. The second one is Zambia, which I think is, if Chile is at the top, Zambia is like here, and then everybody else. Chile produces most of the copper in the world. And the military, Pinochet, maintained copper in state hands after Allende nationalized it. But every new mine that was opened was privatized. So the proposal now is to recover the national resources completely for the public good in order to have the wherewithal with which to actually rectify the injustices produced on 30 years of neoliberalism. So as soon as we have the constitution, you will see what we'll be able to do. But thank you for that warning about British capitalism. We know them so well anyway. And after all, in Chile, we are called the English of Latin America. I don't know why, but we are called that.
Thanks, Francisco. Dan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks very much, Alison. Evening, comrades. Thank you very much for a very interesting and very important discussion, Francisco. Apologies in advance. You may be asked to repeat a couple of things you've already mentioned. I just have a very specific question, really, and it's the mirror of, I think, Kevin's before, which I think a lot of observations that have been made on the left about the recent election have been sort of framed in the terms of what is the right going to do in reaction, what are the Americans going to do to counteract any progress. My question really is, to what extent, and I'm interested to get your observations, to what extent the new president and the coalition are capable of, if you like, embedding socialism in Chile in the further future. I'm conscious, obviously, that there will be a new election in the next, forgive my ignorance, the next 4 or 5 years. All the good work, all the policy 4 years, all the good policy work that will be undertaken in the next 4 years can be very easily undone by the stroke of a pen, by the victory of a right-wing candidate. To what extent, as I say, do you think that this particular government is capable of embedding socialism in Chile to sort of to go beyond that very short-termism?
Yeah. I don't think that's the task. You know, I want socialism to be there tomorrow, but I don't think that's the task that is posed. There are two crucial questions here. Number one is the struggle in Chile is not for power, not yet. It will be at some point soon. I don't know when soon, but it will be. It's not like what is posing in Bolivia or Venezuela or Nicaragua. This is not what is posing in Chile. In Chile, the struggle is for the masses. The masses were duped into believing in neoliberalism in large quantities by the huge, totally criminal, irresponsible expansion of the credit. When you went to Chile, I was poor in Chile in the 1970s, 1960s, we didn't have television. We didn't have telephone, let alone car or everything else. That was normal. If you went to Chile in the 1980s, even the 1990s, everybody had color television, remote control, 86 channels, French, German, Italian, whatever you want. Everybody has a huge amount of credit. And this credit was expanded and expanded and expanded so much that people were poor, they were being ripped off, yet they had a tremendous expansion, tremendous access to a huge amount of credit, which gave them a power of consumption that they couldn't believe it. They felt that Chile was the best country on earth. They developed this xenophobic superiority over everybody else in the region. I remember in the 90s particularly, and that's when the right wing made a huge amount of political and electoral clientele, particularly among the poorest. The poorest were the worst ideologically. In fact, the most right-wing political party, UDI, in Chile, has the support among the lowest socioeconomic bracket in society. It's because of that period. And it's because of that massive mirage of the expansion of credit. Now this is gone. So now we're winning the masses, and I think we have won them, sufficiently. Now we have to keep working on it until we get the constitution. Then our job, and this is the task that is posed right away. We want to dismantle neoliberalism brick by brick, completely demolish it. That's what we want. If, and I'm going to be algebraic here, if as a result of that, we ended up being socialist, I'm not going to have any problem with that. But that's the task. If we're able to dismantle that level of monopolization of the economy, that level of control over the resources, that level of, taking control from multinational companies to the degree that they have on the Chilean economy, if we're able to do all of that, there will be no capitalism left. So I'm not worried about that much. Whether Boric is not posing the question of building socialism. What we do need, however, is that the masses organize themselves in committees, such as committees for the new constitution or committees for a constitution to demolish neoliberalism. They're going to decide what to do, so that these committees are the real, grassroots organizations that will have a stake in what happens, and they will decide, what to defend, what not to defend, and how far to push it. And I know Chile and Latin America in this sense. When under Allende said he wanted to, he had a proposal originally during the electoral campaign of expropriating 200 monopolies. He had to water that down because of, the media and so on was really going really nasty. So he ended up with a proposal of nationalizing 80 monopolies, only 80 from 200. When we went to the streets in 1971, 72, we expropriated 500, just like that. I remember I was doing it, with everybody else. So I'm not worried about what we can do. The question is to have the political framework to do it. If we have a government which is committed to a new anti-neoliberal constitution, whatever the phrase of words that they use to characterize themselves doesn't matter. What matters is the process. And I think the process, it offers so many possibilities. We'll see how far they get. We'll certainly push them along as far as they can go.
Thanks, Francisco. Our next question is going to come from the new president of the RMT. Alex, congratulations, and do you want to ask your question?
Thank you very much, Alison. Thank you, Francisco, for a very interesting introduction. And I wanted to ask you about the relationship of the Chilean trade union movement to the political and economic program that's been put forward by Boric, and which you've been speaking about. You talked about the need for the Chilean people to form committees around the question of the constitution, but the program that you've been speaking about this evening is a program of dismantling neoliberalism. It's an economic and political program, and therefore the question of how the working class in its organizations relates to that program is really important. It's really fundamental. And of course, and I don't know enough or indeed very much at all about the Chilean trade union movement today, as opposed to historically. And I am aware that in Venezuela and indeed in Bolivia, the trade unions played a really critical role in the transformation of those societies in recent years. In Venezuela, the oil unions were under the control of very right-wing forces, yes, and there had to be a revolution in the trade unions themselves to overcome their alliance with the oil petroleum bosses. And in Bolivia, as we know, the trade unions have played a very important role in resisting the coup. So I'm really interested if you can give us a short outline of what the position is with the Chilean labor movement in terms of the trade unions, and in particular, because you've talked about copper and lithium, in particular, the mineral unions and the miners' unions. Thanks.
Yeah, this is quite a privilege to be asked a question by the leader of the RMT, so thank you very much for that. What a privilege. Chilean trade unionism is very weak, and this was by design. The military dictatorship at some point realized that he couldn't just repress and kill all the workers because he needed people to work. He needed a labor market. But he created a labor plan, which still in to some important degree in place, where by design deliberately weakened the main organization that could engage in bargaining, in collective bargaining. And that was trade unions. So for example, in a company, any company, you were entitled to set up a trade union. Obviously, under Pinochet, they would try to assassinate you. But if they didn't, you were able to set up a trade union. But the employer had the capacity and the possibility of setting up or funding, setting up 7 more trade unions. And he did it. In many places, there were 7, 8, 5, 6. And what the bosses did with the existing legislation of the labor plan was that whenever they came, which very rarely did, whenever they came to the question of collective bargaining because of the actions of one of the militant trade union, which was very small, the employer will call all the trade unions existing in his company and will negotiate with them all. And the law allowed them to actually choose the majority or the best or whatever. And even the law allows them to dismiss workers, sub-workers, when and if they were engaged in activities that will complicate the production and the performance of the company. So capital runs totally supreme in Chile. And this is one of the key questions. The TUC, the Chilean TUC, which is the one that holds the old long tradition, is run by a communist comrade, a woman, but it's still a very weak organization. So one of the tasks is going to be to ensure that the labor plan, the labor legislation is dismantled and a new proper labor legislation is in place. The labor unions, the trade unions in the copper companies are in favor, in the copper mines, are totally in favor of, number one, eliminating the labor plan and producing a new legislation so that they can unify, number one. Number two, they want copper to be completely nationalized, all the sector to be brought under public ownership, which is going to ensure the country has resources. So there is plenty to do. And just one footnote. In Venezuela, the driving force of the revolution was not the trade unions, as you correctly pointed out, but it was the poor of the cities. The urban poor were the ones that actually drove the process. In Chile, it's something similar. The unions are so weak. They have done a few things, but they're very weak because they haven't got the possibility of materializing their demands or their action into something tangible because the system is against them. The main activity came from urban sectors, trade unions, women, other sectors which are allies of the working class. So the working class needs a substantial amount of recomposing, and this process, which just began, I think is going to allow this to happen. And thankfully, we have the leadership of the TUC in Chile run by the correct political lines. So hopefully we'll get there.
Muted myself there, rookie mistake. Thank you, Francisco. We are starting to get tight for time now. So we've still got two people with their hands up. If you don't mind, Stuart, as you've already asked a question, I'd just like to bring Tony in for the last one.
Thanks very much, Francisco, and thanks for organising the meeting. Just very quickly then, obviously, as the president of Chile, Boric will become the commander of the armed forces, which are one of the most technologically advanced armed forces in South America, supplied with equipment from Germany, Israel, United States, and Spain, I think. What has been the reaction from the armed forces to his election, and what will be, in your opinion, the reaction if he tries to pursue any social programs which they see as going against their interests? Thank you.
Sure. I think I answered this question already, but they are right-wing. There's no question about it. The generals are right-wing, and they come from the old regime. So they don't like Boric. I'm sure they don't. But I don't think, whatever the technical capacities may be, I don't think they have the political context within which they can really go for something like that. They're being massively discredited because of the levels of corruption which has rotten the institution, particularly the army, not necessarily so much the Navy or the Air Force, but particularly the army, which is the largest. There's been massively, there is a scandal which is so big that it's been investigated. There are several generals in prison. So I don't think it's possible. We'll see what they do. I think it's too early to say too much about what they might be able to do. The main thing that they need, if they're going to go for some serious destabilization, first to prevent any economic activity, any economic proposal from Boric being undertaken by Boric, so that he begin to rectify things. number one. And number two, they need to mobilize right-wing forces to destabilize, to create a context which will allow them to create a crisis, which I don't think is possible certainly in the next 6 months, because what is going to dominate the agenda is going to be the referendum and the context, the process for a new constitution. We'll see. At any rate, just another small footnote, the most technically advanced armed forces in South America are the Venezuelan ones. Just in case, even though.
Thanks, Francisco. What a great discussion. Thanks, everyone, for coming along. I'm going to wind it up there.
Can you allow me to say one final, just to contextualize?
Yes, you want to sum up, by all means.
Yeah, I think thank you very much again. This is wonderful discussion. And Latin America is moving to the left, The United States is losing out, we're winning. Cuba survived, Venezuela survived, Nicaragua survived, we got back Bolivia, we won in Peru, we won in Honduras, we won in Chile, we are going to win in Brazil in October next year. That's going to shift the whole thing quite dramatically. We won in Mexico, Argentina, even though all of them with complexities. So I think the process is quite interesting, and the shining example of neoliberalism, which imperialism and capitalism was able to show, namely Chile, is gone flat. So therefore, we have tremendous possibilities. And more than that, something I don't want to develop that much, but just to give a very brief context of, which is the international geopolitical situation is such that, we are very favorable. We have a very favorable context. The United States is massively declining. And we have tremendous allies in the East, particularly in China. I just read the other day, China is the main trading partner of 144 nations in the world. That gives you an idea. In other words, we can get credit, we can get investment, we can get technology, and we can have markets. With the United States, we get assassination and military bases. So the options is totally clear, in my view. So therefore, the Chilean development is taking place in this context, but it's going to be messy, it's going to be bumpy. All we can ask of you, comrades, is to be understanding and patient. We'll do things our own way, but we'll get there. Thank you again for the invitation.
Thanks, Francisco, and solidarity with Chile. Okay. Bye-bye for now then, everyone.
Thanks, Francisco. Great stuff, mate. Great stuff. Cheers.
Thanks. Muchas gracias.
De nada.
Gracias.
Well done, Manchester.